So, in these ideas from Jung, I'm going to go through these couple of pages and basically talk about what I discovered. Yeah, this starting from page 70, we see here the idea of the descent of the soul. So this idea is that the soul sort of lives in some higher spiritual plane, higher vibrational plane or higher energetic plane, and it has to descend through layers or levels of increasing density or materiality as it gets closer to our plane of existence. And that includes incarnation into different lives. So the idea that our past lives and future lives are different aspects of the soul. But also through that sort of horizontally through time, right? But also down through different fated influences. So the idea is that the biblical equivalent of the fall into history, the fall into the human condition, is kind of falling into time and space. And time and space are the properties of the Great Mother. It's a feminine symbol, the symbol of the wheel of fate. It's equivalent to the eight-spoked wheel in Buddhism, and also the 8 legs of the great spider. These are different aspects of the Great Mother symbolism. So the idea is that we've fallen into our 4-dimensional existence down from the higher dimensions, and that the soul not only incarnates in these different lives, but it descends through these different layers or levels of energy. And this is a theme that runs through Neoplatonism, which is essentially the spiritual backbone of Western culture. This theme also obviously shows up in the Gnostic traditions and in psychedelia, essentially worldwide. And that's why I think it's worth trying to understand. So it's a model of spiritual development, the idea being that if one wishes to work with the soul, and indeed to liberate the soul from its condition of being fated or determined by these influences, that one can work with these layers of energy. I mentioned just in passing that the goal is not only to liberate the soul, but to allow the soul to fully participate in each of those levels. So now I'm going to talk a little bit more about what that means. So I'm going to quote Jung a little. Quote, "This sounds very psychological, and in fact, life never goes forward except at the place where it's come to a standstill. The sort for Mercurius is the spiritus vegetativus, a living spirit, whose nature it is to run through all the houses of the planets, the entire zodiac. We could just as well say through the entire horoscope, or since the horoscope is the chronometric equivalent of individual character, through all the characterological components of the personality." Okay, so what does this mean? Basically, in the alchemical way of speaking about this, the goal of individual development or the liberation of the soul is to seek for the philosopher's stone, which is also the divine child, which is also the spirit of Mercury, Mercurius, Quicksilver. So Mercury is kind of like the goal of the process of spiritual development, alchemically. And in this context, he's the living spirit. And so what we're talking about is, when we talk about liberating the soul, well, the soul is animation. It's connected with aliveness. And so we're liberating our vitality, our own aliveness. So we're trying to get closer to the source of life, the source of vitality. And finding Mercury is equivalent to that. And it says, whose nature it is to run through all the houses of the planets, the entire zodiac. Okay, so basically the idea here is that the planets, traditionally the 7 planets, namely the Sun, the Moon, Mercury, Mars, Venus, Jupiter, and Saturn, and more modernly also Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, these correspond with these different energies. So the planets are kind of like these, well, they're symbolic representations. And in Jungian terms, we can simply consider them to be vessels of archetypal energy. The idea being that by working with these different energies, that one can liberate oneself from their influence. And so what do I mean by that? Well, there's a couple of things. Many different models in psychology are coming to the realization that it's inner dialogue can be very powerful. And in something like internal family systems therapy, the idea would be to interact with these different parts of ourselves that can release pain, and so heal in this way through dialogue, through relationship. And one of the questions is, what determines which parts there are? And one of the answers is that at a surface level of the psyche, at the personal level of the unconscious, these parts correspond to whatever has traumatized us in our biography, in our postnatal, post-birth existence. However, at the deeper levels of the psyche, which correspond to the collective unconscious, the parts that one may engage with are of a more collective quality. And I think we can see here how the planets which rule different parts of the zodiac, we can simply talk about, there's some interaction here between the planets and the signs of the zodiac, which I haven't quite yet sorted out, but I'm simply wanting to observe that both the planets and the signs of the zodiac correspond to different collections or amalgamations of psychic energy, and that by relating with them, one can differentiate oneself from those forces and recognize that one is not bound by them, and to become unbound. And so this is what allows Jung to say something like, quote, "This is the very ancient idea of what we might call an inborn bill of debt to fate. It's the Western version of a prenatal karma. It is the archons, the 7 rulers of the planets, who imprint its fate upon the soul." Thus, Priscillian says that the soul, on its descent to birth, passes through certain circles, where it is made captive by evil powers, and in accordance with the will of the victorious prince, is forced into diverse bodies, and his handwriting inscribed upon it. So what he's talking about here is that when the soul descends, it's imprinted with the influences of these various planetary aspects, these various planetary spheres. And that's essentially what a natal chart is. So the horoscope shows how one is influenced by these planetary forces. And by extension, it also shows how, with something like the transits, for example, it shows how, it not only shows how those forces show up in one's character more permanently, but it also shows how at certain moments in time, there are different opportunities to work with specific energies as they manifest in one's specific biography. Like that different aspects of the chart will be relevant or available to be worked on more readily at different times. Okay, and now I'm going to share a little bit about the specifics of this process of working with the soul. Yeah, so we're talking about the spiritual development of the soul, which is a kind of combination of a psychological model of the psyche that includes transpersonal layers, Neoplatonic philosophy that includes Gnostic elements, and a model of spiritual development that is compatible with nature mysticism and seasonal ritual. That's what we're talking about. And so Mercurius, who is the goal in the alchemical language, or the liberation of the soul, the source of life, can only be found through this process of ascent and descent, up and down the ladder of the planets. It says, quote, "The circular distillation, beginning with the black lead, with the darkness, coldness, and malignity of the malefic Saturn, then ascending through the other planets to the fiery soul, the sun, where the gold is heated in the hottest fire and cleansed of all impurities. And finally, returning to Saturn, where this time he meets Mercurius and receives some useful teachings from him. Saturn has here changed from a star of ill omen into a domus barbae, house of the beard, where the wisest of all, thrice greatest Hermes, imparts wisdom." Okay, what does this mean? Well, I talked about how the soul incarnates down through these various levels that correspond to the different archetypal qualities of the different planets, for example. Notice that in traditional astrology, Saturn, and indeed astronomically as well, Saturn is the furthest from us, and is therefore the widest circle and the first layer that the soul descends through. So down through Saturn, and then through Jupiter, and then I think it would be through Mars, through Venus, and then Mercury, Moon, and Sun, or Moon, Mercury, and Sun, if I've got that right. Doesn't matter so much. So that's the way that the soul incarnates down through those levels, incarnates into multiple lives, I should say. But when we're working from our point of view, well, then we actually have to, in some way, begin with Saturn. And this is because Saturn, in psychological terms, corresponds with one's shadow. Wherever Saturn is placed, whatever sign of the zodiac Saturn is placed within in one's chart, has a good deal of indication about what are the shadowy qualities of one's own psyche, one's personality. And so there's a way that this is the beginning point of the process of ascent. So the process of ascent sort of begins with Saturn. From our point of view, begins with what is darkest or lowest, and it ascends up toward the sun, which is the brightest and highest. Again, quote, "where the gold is heated in the hottest fire and cleansed of all impurities." But then it sort of goes down again through the different layers down to Saturn. And the aspect of Saturn then changes to, instead of being the shadow, being the kind of wise old man figure, where Hermes Trismegistus imparts wisdom. This is a kind of equivalent. So what I would imagine here is in obviously the connection. So for example, in IFS, we work with our different parts. Right now, imagine some improvisation work like acting, where we take one of those parts and we take it to a caricature, to an extreme. This can be a very powerful exercise where we see that we are not those parts. We're not reduced to them. They're, in fact, just parts of us, just characters, just masks that we wear. Well, in the same way, if we did that with these, for example, these archetypal energies. So imagine seasonal rituals devoted to different deities, different beings. For example, at the beginning of each of the seasons, I could mention just in passing a couple of them. Yes, this is from the next page. The seasons of, for example, Aries, Cancer, Libra, and Capricorn. These are ruled by Mars as the ruler of Aries, and it's the cardinal fire sign, the beginning of the season. The moon is the ruler of Cancer, and it's the cardinal water sign. Venus is the ruler of Libra, and it's the cardinal air sign. And Saturn is the ruler of Capricorn, and it's the cardinal earth sign. So the idea is that these seasonal rituals could correspond with the worship of, or the manifestation, the invoking, the summoning of these different powers, and that this, in a way, enables one to transcend them. So by honoring them, by bringing out those aspects of one's character in ritual, one is actually able to differentiate or disidentify from those aspects of the chart, and so not be so fated by them, or in terms of internal family systems, not be so blended with those energies. And in this way, this combination of seasonal ritual, improvisation work, and disidentification from these different personal and collective qualities of the psyche. This is equivalent to this process of ascent and descent, a purification of the soul, where the soul, or that which is most alive and individual about one, is progressively liberated from those energies, but also able to deeply participate in them at the same time. The result of that process is that one is able to, alchemically speaking, find Mercurius, the mercurial energy which is beyond the sun, the gold which is beyond gold. We also notice in passing that the sequence of colors, like the colors of the rainbow, correspond with these different planets. And through, if I draw from Neoplatonism and theurgy and the ritual a little bit more, and ritual magic in particular, people like Marcello Ficino from the 15th century, we can see not only are there certain colors associated with the different planets, but the different gods. For example, we could talk about the Greek and Roman gods even got into the names of the planets. Mars, well, that's a Roman name, or I think Aries is the Roman name. Anyway, it doesn't matter. The point is, the gods have different flavors. They have different kinds of music, different colors, different styles, and that different rituals designed to invoke and work with those styles could be a way of working more effectively with those energies, or honoring the gods ritualistically. And so these colors, we can also see that they correspond to the psychological process of individuation, which is this developmental process that we're speaking about. So, for example, grey and black correspond to Saturn and the evil world. They symbolize the beginning in darkness, in the melancholy, fear, wickedness, and wretchedness of ordinary human life. It also corresponds to the shadow. As I said, this is like the beginning. We begin in a state of confusion and dullness. And through this process, we not only ascend, or we not only get deeper into the psyche, beyond the shadow, but we also gain wisdom, and we liberate the soul to the access of these other qualities, which are represented by the different planets and the different colors, respectively. Yes, and that means that, quote, the ascent through the planetary spheres therefore meant something like a shedding of the characterological qualities indicated by the horoscope, a retrogressive liberation from the character imprinted by the archons. The conscious or unconscious model for such an ascent was the Gnostic Redeemer, who either deceives the archons by guile or breaks their power by force. Yeah, so we're talking about a release from fate. We're talking about a process of the rebirth of the soul and the shedding of each of these archetypal qualities. I want to make clear that it's not about getting rid of them. It's actually about being able to work with these energies and participate more deeply in them so as not to be reduced to them, to bring them up into consciousness, not to withdraw from participation in them. The different signs of the zodiac obviously correspond to how the different planetary energies show up in each individual horoscope, and therefore they can have a very strong influence over what kinds of work become available to people at different moments in time. One way to talk about that is that different parts show up at different moments in time to work with, but also that different energies are going to be very, very present in different seasons. And so this is actually a way for us to tie a model of seasonality, like a calendar model of a wheel of different events, to working with people's individual characters through something, for example, like Shimon's consciousness bandwidth assessment. This is a way of working with people's individual horoscopes to talk with them and prepare them for how their different aspects of their horoscope and how the ways that the different aspects of their horoscope show up in their psychology could show up on different occasions, especially occasions that involve powerful ritual or deep inner work involving breathwork or psychedelics, for example. In the long term, it could be a way of using horoscopes to predict what kinds of energies, therefore what kinds of characters are going to show up for individuals and also for the collective at different moments, where we can have a calendar, a seasonal calendar with different rituals devoted to different deities or different energies, and that each person is able to participate in those collective rituals that have a kind of shared theme, but also in a deeply personal, individual way by working with their own horoscope. And so we end up with a kind of a heroic quality when we're talking about the liberation of the soul. And so the soul is sort of able to step through these different layers of energy archetypally. And that means that the soul essentially is no longer unconsciously influenced by them, but is in fact consciously sort of in control, but it's not exactly about control. It's more like able to participate deeply in those powers without being unconsciously moved around by them. So Jung says, the journey through the planetary houses boils down to becoming conscious of the good and bad qualities in our character. Yeah, so the goal is to be more conscious or more aware. We see, I'm just on the next page now, on 72. This is how we get these themes of like a circular stairway with 7 doors and representing the 7 planets, with an 8th door at the top representing Mercurius or Mercury. We also get a ladder with 7 rungs again corresponding to the 7 planets. And it's this process of, again, ascent and descent, not just one direction. It's this rhythmic quality. It also corresponds to harmonics. This is the vibrational metaphysics. For example, this is the archetype of 7 and 8. We see that in musical octaves, for example, and also in the days of the week across chronological time. Yeah, I'm just about to finish here, but there's some idea here of the, again, I was talking about the archetype of 7 and 8 just before, the theme, but it also goes along with the theme of 3 and 4 that I've been talking about a lot, where there's deep in pre-Socratic philosophy and in Hermetic philosophy and also Gnosticism is the idea of the quaternity, or a 4 rather than a trinity. And so Jung feels that this combination of 4 is deeply important to the mandala symbolism, and restoring 3 into 4 is something that he writes a lot about. And this really corresponds with, 4 is mentioned in many different places. Just briefly, he talks about how the church, the Christian church, was increasingly focused on differentiating ritual from dogma. And so the rituals, which we all are interested in, have pagan and shamanic roots, whereas Christianity, in combination with Roman culture, became increasingly involved in dogmatics and essentially debate and philosophy. And that was really separated from ritual practice. Whereas the more ancient traditions, such as alchemy and astrology, they were and Gnosticism, I would say, actually, no, not Gnosticism. They were involved in preserving the bridge to nature rather than differentiating ritual and dogma. That's part of the reason that I'm interested in them. And this corresponds with the roots of Greek philosophy. Plato is quite focused on the trinity of the good, true, and beautiful, whereas Pythagoras, who is more ancient and much more mystical, is focused on 4, the tetrakis, which he says contains the roots of eternal nature. And so here we have the idea that the soul is a kind of square, not a triangle. And so we're talking about this sort of 4-fold aspect, which shows up in many different places. If you want to describe the horizon, there are sort of 4 quarters, 4 different directions. There are also the 4 elements that we know, the four primary qualities, which we could also talk about. What he means there, I think, is the psychological faculties. He thinks of thinking and feeling, sensation and intuition. We also usually have 4 primary colors, 4 different castes in Hinduism, or classes in society, also corresponding with 4 different ways of spiritual development in those cultures, which we could really think about as the most spiritually ancient, I think, the Hindus. So this 4 is very deep. Yes, and so we have here also the notion that the 12 signs of the zodiac are split up into the 4 different elements, with 3 signs per element, and these corresponds also with the 4 seasons. And so, as I was saying, the cardinal signs, Aries, Cancer, Libra, and Capricorn, sort of correspond with the beginning of each of the seasons. But that means that if you consider a model of spiral dynamics, or development through time, that means that they also form a kind of circle, a circle of progression through the different seasons. So the synthesis of the different elements here corresponds with this synthesis of kind of different rituals at different seasons in time. So that where the alchemical aim is a kind of circulation which involves the production of the, quote, original man, who is a sphere. And so this kind of corresponds with a process of rebirth or liberation of the soul that involves kind of fulfilling or completing the different stages at the different seasons, which correspond to the different energies of the different houses that in some way is able to produce the liberated soul. And just briefly, in terms of the beginning of those seasons, I mentioned again Aries, Cancer, Libra, and Capricorn. The ruling planets being Mars, Moon, Venus, and Saturn, respectively. Fire, water, air, and earth. Well, two of those are typically masculine, Mars and Saturn, and two of them are typically feminine, the Moon and Venus. So we're also working here with masculine and feminine energies through the seasons. And there's also obviously light and darkness going on. Mars and Saturn both have distinctly shadowy qualities. Obviously, so do the Moon and Venus, but they all also have lighter aspects. Yeah, and so maybe I would talk here about how the sort of the maleficent or negative quality of those different planets could involve the ways that they show up as shadow, the ways that they show up as fate or compulsion, which gives them a kind of injurious effect of a kind of specific influence. And that kind of that relates to this kind of division into many aspects or sub-personalities. Whereas if we want to make ourselves whole, if we want to make ourselves into one whole person, then it involves transforming those kinds of qualities, those lights, from their dark to their lighter aspects, which basically involves integrating the energies associated with each of the planets. And just to finish off, the conclusion of that process is the production of the philosopher's stone, or it's also the original man, which is kind of like the Superman, the anthropos. It's also the production of the water of life, elixir of life, the elixir of immortality. It's the same process. The liberation of the soul. It's again another symbol of the same process, but it's also a process of a kind of coming into deeper consciousness. So I would talk here about reverse engineering enlightenment, and becoming more whole as a personality in Jungian terms, individuation. They all correspond with the same process of psychospiritual development, particularly in terms of collective awakening, because we're clearly talking about energies that are in the collective layer of the unconscious and that show up in deeply personal ways, but that we're bringing ourselves into wholeness, but we're actually also bringing the human community into wholeness. So it's the soul of the world that is actually waking up through us, and where each of our souls is a kind of facet on the jewel of the world soul. Again, Indra's net is the appropriate symbol there. So we're not just waking up ourselves, we're waking up as community, we're waking up as the soul of the world. And that corresponds, I would mention at this point, to it's a transformation of self and world, meaning sort of subject and object, inside and outside. Where that's why the focus on reunifying with nature is so important, because it's actually becoming aware as nature. It's kind of animism. It's a kind of restoring our awareness as that which we are surrounded by, so that our consciousness is not so focused within, between our eyes somewhere, but we're actually conscious that we are awakened nature. So a more deeply incarnated consciousness. Yeah, this synthesis of four is one of the main preoccupations of alchemy. Yeah, there's symbols of the goal. There's the production of Hermes is the result. The arrival of Hermes is another symbol of the divine child or awakened consciousness, and it refers to a synthesis of the planets or the metals with the sun. So it's a kind of smelting process, or kind of like how you forge a sword, making it really strong out of different kinds of metals. and the result of which is a kind of crown which will be within Hermes, quote. Yeah, the crown signifies the kingly totality. It stands for unity and is not subject to fate. Also equivalent to the crown of wisdom, which is a thing. So again, it's a wisdom school model of seasonal rituals that are designed to work with different archetypal energies in the theme of the planets, or indeed the signs of the zodiac, that can correspond to this deeply personal process of psychological development, but at the same time the collective development of the soul of the world. Again, the final idea being that it's by liberating the soul that we can actually work with the soul, and so by working out of what is most creative or unique about us, by creating and collaborating from out of that aspect, the results of that are increasingly divine, increasingly sacred, increasingly amazing, increasingly exactly what we need. So the idea here is that the soul is that which gives birth to God. The soul, God is born in the soul. So the purpose of liberating the soul in this way is so that the soul is not so influenced by these collective and archetypal forces, so that the soul is free to do this the work of midwifing or giving birth to collective consciousness, or the rebirth of God is the language that we have for that. I would just mention finally that it's we can actually get a feeling for how that begins in a symbolic way, especially when we talk about the four of thinking and feeling, sensing and intuiting. We're talking about these faculties that we have that are kind of the deepest sense-making architecture that humans have available. And so when we get in touch with what's new, with the God that is reborn through the soul, we should be able to think toward it, feel toward it, get a sense of it, and intuit its presence, the presence of God, all at the same time. And that's why working with these geometries and symbols and creativity artwork has become so interesting to me. It's because those are the kinds of symbolic, archetypal, creative structures that are able to be felt, thought, sensed, and intuited all at the same time, not just represented. Okay, this feels like a pretty thorough summary of everything that I just worked out. So I'm going to stop. Thank you very much for listening to what I've shared.